Thank you so much for coming. And today, as you can see from the title, we have an incredibly all-encompassing subject. Basically, the end of the world, the new world order. Should we begin with the end of the world? Do you think, Peter?
It's a bit early in the morning.
It's a bit early in the morning for them. Well, maybe we'll end with the end of the world. But perhaps I should just start by saying we're going to be talking about everything. Rather like the world at the moment, there are no rules in here at all. Feel free to intervene whenever you like and ask a question of Peter. And I just want to say that, Peter, you've played a big role with your Silk Roads books, 2 books, of really kind of expanding history. You know, when we were growing up, history was really just about sort of the Tudors and the Romans and Hitler. And you've helped expand it to the East, just at the moment that the East is perceived as rising. So let me start with you yourself. How did you, as a little boy, how did you discover history? And what made you want to write history?
Gosh, that's a question a shrink would ask. I don't know.
I'm a psychiatrist. My father was a psychiatrist, so you'll have to forgive me.
Gosh, well, when we came on, I thought it was Another One Bites the Dust was the soundtrack, so I'm pleased that that's not what I'm up for. It's a really good question. So I don't know is the answer, but what I do remember is that as a boy, one of the few programs that we always had to watch at home was John Craver's Newsround. And I remember watching John Craver's Newsround, and all the stuff that was on the news was about Soviet missile deployment in East Germany, it was about the PLO, it was about Israel, it was about revolution in Iran, it was about so-called Vietnamese boat people, it was about the end of the Khmer Rouge in 1979, 1980, and then Ethiopia in the mid-80s. But I just remember sitting, I loved history and I love those stories about Henry VIII and the First and Second World War, and there's a lot to learn, but I could never quite understand why what I was learning in the classroom had absolutely no relation to what seemed to be important in the news and important in the world. And particularly, I think, the thing that really, both excited me and I was scared about, if you want to talk about the end of the world, was that, we grew up in a world where we were certain that nuclear war would kill us all. It was just a question of when that would happen. There was bound to be either a miscalculation or an unwarranted escalation between the US and the USSR, and that someone was going to fire a nuclear device, and that we were doomed. So it wasn't quite programmed that I was guaranteed to die before we were old and happy or unhappy, but that very polarized world was something that I really wanted to understand why. And as you're a great historian of Russian history, if you once you start to look at different peoples in different ways and really immerse yourself, you just get a very different set of questions. So even when I was a teenage boy, I was obsessed by Russian literature. I was very lucky that was a school where I could learn Russian, and then even luckier that my Russian teacher had been in naval intelligence and had taught himself Arabic. So he taught 4 of us Arabic in a year up to kind of A-level standards. So by the time I went to university, I went there, I studied Russian for my part 1 because I just wanted to find about these other parts of the world. I didn't imagine it would come together, and trying to say maybe we should write about history that's not just about other people, but maybe we should write about history that explains how we're connected all to these kinds of
and how other people see us is the key.
Which we've got
isn't
no
that
idea.
The key challenge?
We've
isn't
got
it?
absolutely no idea.
Yeah, do you think one of the interesting things about history is like when people look the same, but in fact it's the realization that we actually have no idea what was going on in their minds at that time, and that's the challenge of history, isn't it?
Well, so I've just been in Athens to do something, and so I'm working on sort of Greece and its orientation eastwards is something that I've worked on for a long time. And as a Byzantinist at Oxford, that's part of my day job. And I came across Macaulay writing in the early 19th century saying that the single most important event in English history was the Battle of Marathon, which is quite something. You'd think we say Battle of ... A lot of people would say Hastings, right?
Yeah.
I guess some people might vote for Bosworth.
Yeah.
Maybe Dunkirk. But the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC between the Greeks and the Persians, that somehow the English think this is fundamental to the English way of how we've conceptualized the world. And I think that those conceptualizations are really important, and I'm sure we'll talk about the contemporary world too, but I think that lack of knowledge about other parts of the world is profound, and it's both dangerous because we don't understand the world, but it's also reckless that young people are brought up knowing the same stuff that you and I did for O-level and A-level, where there's no texture about what the rest of the world is going on. And when we do open up and look at other people, we look at chapters that self-edit. We look at the slave trade, which sets up, we should only look at Africa within a context of how Europeans engaged, and in a negative way, which we'll talk about this evening. But, other parts of the world, we can't, it's like shooting in the dark, and I think we should do much, much better.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that you just mentioned was about the end times and you're of course you're a Byzantine expert. I mean, why is it, do you think, that throughout human history, certainly since the Christian era, we are always convinced the world is about to end? I mean, whether it was sort of chiliastic millenarianism, all those sort of apocalyptic feelings. What is it about human nature? And this runs through all your work, in fact, but especially Byzantium, is that feeling that we think it's absolutely unique at the moment because for all sorts of crazy reasons, the supply chain, the pandemic, China's super hypersonic weaponry, whatever, Donald Trump, we think the world is ending.
Yeah.
Actually, people have always thought, you mentioned the Cold War, we always expected the nuclear. Why is that, do you think?
It's not just a Christian thing. I mean, the Indic religions, Mesopotamian and Akkadian, Sumerian, and Babylonian. It's all about the end of a cycle, typically of a cycle of either reincarnation or of kind of your time is limited, you're doomed, and therefore it's a profoundly important question from a human point of view. What happens to us afterwards? So I suppose on one level, those ideas that doom is going to become accelerated is a source of fascination and fear. If you were taking a structural approach, you'd say people who exploit that are the priesthood. And it doesn't have to be a priesthood to do with faith. In the priesthood today who are preaching catastrophe, Thucydides traps, the confrontation of China and the United States. There are lots of them in the State Department and in the Department of Defense in Washington who talk like priests, and they have powers of priests because their position rests on an authority to make sense of the world. So I think it's two things. It's partly that we are fascinated and fearful about things coming to an end, but I think that there's also a way in which that power gets exploited by the creation of structures that enable people to control society. I think it's a very important element, and that runs across the Quranic tradition, that runs across the Judaic traditions. And the importance of rabbis as not just intellectual scholars but as guides, and priests in all religions. So I think there is something fundamental in us as human beings in trying to engage with what that disaster looked like, and particularly natural disaster, because famine and floods and climatic events are all sort of part of that cycle where either God is punishing us or we're not responding well enough to the challenges in front of us, and that there are consequences because we have these terrible scenes that follow.
But you touched on that. I mean, we live in an age now which seems completely secular, but in fact every age has an orthodoxy and a credo and a priesthood. You mentioned someone in the State Department, but also there's a machinery today of thought that is an orthodoxy, and it's really the job of historians to both reflect that and react against it, isn't it?
Yeah, although we're priests of our own,
We're the priests.
Behold what I think we should be reading about, and here's why we should learn about Jerusalem or about the Silk Road. So, I think one has to take that all with a slight pinch of salt, and the difference is that, you have to buy my books rather than I have a budget of $860 billion a year, which you have if you're in the Department of Defense.
Yeah.
And so I think that there is that idea about what should we control. So, I mean, it's one of the interesting responses, I guess, to Silk Roads having been so successful, is that people say, well, how come we didn't do this before and look at the world that's joined up? And now all history should be like this. Now you can't write a book that doesn't throw in. So it's got lots of people trawling through Wikipedia to find out who are the Abbasids, rephrase it and chop it up a little bit, and then throw them into a story of whichever period you want. So I think that now the pressure is to globalize everything, and editors saying to writers, you can't write just about an English person writing in England. You've got to somehow connect that to events all over the world. So it's highly faddish, and in fact it then gets watered down because the key thing is not the gathering information, it's how do you analyse. I mean,
and how do you link
more
it?
than anyone.
Yeah.
It's reading these complicated sources. How do you understand the transmission, the authorship? What are the kind of questions you should ask as a professional skill set of a historian? Learning how to read is one of the key things, and why the literature festival like this is so important. It's not the Clifton History Festival. because it's the writing element that's the crucial thing. Handling complex literary materials requires sophistication of readership, and that's a skill we undersell to historians in particular, because we think, well, people 1,000 years ago were all credulous, they all believed in God, they did what monks and priests told them to do, rather than thinking, were they really that stupid and we're so smart today? Or maybe people maybe we're overshaped by what survives of the literature, and that's more important. And again, your stuff on Jerusalem tackles that so well, about you can't just believe everything you read, but these stories are being told for a reason.
Yeah.
And
the stories matter too.
Right.
The lies matter as much as the truths,
Absolutely.
don't they? I mean, that's part of it. Let's move on to China, because we're all fascinated by China. Just to come at it from different ways. First of all, I mean, the British Empire lasted 300 years-ish. I mean, the American century's been a century. I mean, how long can China stay on top? It's just got there.
Well, if there's a American warship gets targeted while we're talking, it might not last till this afternoon.
Yeah. So we might then have the end times during the next hour.
It could be in real time as it happens right now.
Yeah.
So I think one can't model fragility, right? On a kind of Franz Ferdinand being shot on the streets of Sarajevo. If you'd said soon after that we're going to have a world in the next 4 years where every single European country, which at that time more or less every single one had an empire, every single one is going to lose it in the course of the next 4 years. Britain is going to go from being the biggest creditor nation in the world to being the biggest debtor nation in the course of 4 years. No one would believe you. So single sort of black swan or fragility events are hard to think through how those play out. So what might happen is it's the variables are almost unlimited. I think what's more sobering is that we think of China as being on top, but China is not a rich country. It's got an enormous economy on a sort of PPP basis. It's bigger than the US, but average income in China is about $10,000, which is a kind of getting towards the middle of middle developed countries. So we get thrown by seeing Bentleys in Shanghai and wonderful Chanel stores in China, but there are millions.
I think we're under fire from China now.
But China still is in the process of growing, and if one could take lots of different views. And in fact, I've been on an aircraft carrier this week talking about exactly how one tries to assess what kind of threat China poses and what kind of military, strategic, and joining all the dots, how one tries to understand what we're looking at. But one other thing I suppose is that China is going through an adolescence of having quite clumsy muscles. It sort of doesn't quite know what it wants. It knows it doesn't want to be told what to do by the grown-ups in the room or by the United States or by the UK telling to behave more like us. So there's a bit of push in the system, and equally we're not quite clear what it is that we want China to do. So is the problem that we don't want China to grow, but we don't want China to behave in the way that they're behaving, and in which case which bits? And there are lots of these kinds of elements I think that we have to think carefully about. When I started writing about Uyghurs and Xinjiang and internment camps 4 years ago, and there was no interest at all across politicians, across media, across anything, until about a year ago, where suddenly it became quite a visible story in the press, and we talked a lot about. There's a lot about saying maybe we should sanction China, boycott the Olympic Games, and so on. But even in the UK, our imports from Xinjiang went up by 190% last year.
Right.
So the cotton that's being made and the Nike trainers that are being made in very questionable humanitarian conditions, if not worse, we say one thing and we do another. So in terms of China, its velocity, what's it going to try to do? It's a huge, big question. The more important one, I guess, from our point of view, is how does that affect us? Is China getting richer and stronger? I mean, the Prime Minister of Singapore put it very well. He said, people tell me I should be worried about China. And the way I see it is the richer China gets, more good for them and more good for us. So, I think we've got to work through what are the strategic stress points, of which there are lots, but we don't evaluate properly because our base knowledge is, I'd say, somewhere between zero and minimal.
Yeah. I mean, isn't one of the problems, though, that China's, in a way, is slowed down, and the president has aspired to this massive sort of world role now, and yet, there's been a slowdown, and now resistance is beginning to China from America, obviously, and to a certain extent Europe. And how is he going to meet those aspirations? Is that going to put a danger? Is that the real danger, that China isn't expanding as quickly as it was, but could now be experiencing resistance for the first time, having sort of having since 1972 been able to sort of, in partnership with America, expand exactly as it wishes, trade where it wishes, isn't the problem now that China is suddenly challenged and therefore may become dangerous?
Yeah, quite possibly. I mean, I'm not quite sure what to pick out there. I mean, yes, a lot depends what you think it is that China's doing. And when you talk about slowing down, I mean, we over-insert ourselves in the West into what we think Chinese strategic thinking is. Right? We assume that most decisions are based around reactions to what goes on in the world outside. But China on its own is somewhere between 1.2 and 1.4 billion people, the population of. A friend of ours, Dick Smith at Cambridge University, who's professor of demographics, reminds us that China's population might be wrong by between 10 and 15%, right? Either plus or minus.
Yeah, which is a lot of people.
It's a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
So there are lots of things. I mean, I think that there's strategy and strategic planning which has a military and a geopolitical element to it, and then there's economic growth, where in a globalized system, China is part of our supply chains. I mean, for example, of the 200 suppliers that Apple has, 88% of them are in Asia, and about half of those are in China. So to say, well, let's decouple, there's a lot of noise right now in Washington about supply chains, the congestion in ports, the sort of breakdown of, the things that are going to get much, much worse in the coming weeks and months, that maybe we should reshore and Apple should be building their iPhones in Texas, which is, great, but it takes, takes years. I mean,
it takes 10 years.
It takes us 25 years to build a nuclear reactor.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, that's what we're planning. And do you think, well, that's great, if we're going to have nuclear energy, that we'll have that by 2050 in time for the next whatever Olympics is going to be then. But, there are, if you don't plan ahead, it's very difficult and it's expensive to put things in place because you're always second guessing. So I think that, some of my best friends work on Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic. One of the wonderful degrees at Cambridge. But there are more students today at Cambridge studying Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic than there are studying Chinese. Right? So I don't want to have any funding cut from my colleagues working on Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic.
Yeah.
But it would tell me that we are completely strategically, economically, politically, militarily, across the board, completely unprepared to make any sensible kind of decision about China, whether it's about the history, whether it's about business, whether it's about supply chains. If you're a young person to say, should I go and work in Shanghai tomorrow? Should I go and invest in real estate in whatever? It's might as well blindfold yourself and throw a dart at a donkey's bottom. And that's terrifying because we're quite thoughtful about how we think about other things. We're quite thoughtful about thrashing out Brexit. And we spent 5 years obsessed just on fish and, all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Which is, it is not unimportant. But in the grand scheme of the sweep of history, Brexit is genuinely not even a footnote compared to the stuff that is going on in the world that is significantly more important. And it's not just a China story. That story is places that as well, like Pakistan and India, which have combined population of 1.5 billion. When you start to cluster up the countries that I work on, getting through now into Southeast Asia as well, you're 70% of the world's population live east of Istanbul. Add in West Africa, that is the other significant region we should be focusing on. And we're well above 75%. And so it's great that we admire ourselves in the mirror and think very hard about history, but maybe we need to also move beyond some of that kind of history that we look at. And
I agree with that. And that's why I'm just jumping on about 5 things that you're saying there. One of them is, we've replaced being obsessed with the sort of Tudors, talking about history a little bit and the study of history. I mean, we were all brought up only studying the Tudors, and being told that we deserved enormous reverence for abolishing the slave trade, for example, without ever really telling us that we were running the slave trade. But now we're absolutely obsessed with the British Empire, good and bad, and which is a new sort of Anglo-centricity, Eurocentricity. When we still haven't, we're still talking about England, basically. Exactly. So we really should be talking about. So how do we cope with that? With what's happening at the moment?
That's absolutely fine. And I think it's the more the better. The more great books. The roster of people speaking this weekend. It's like being the kind of classic. It's like the best of the 1980s. One of those albums where everyone is a winner. Everybody walking around here today. They're all geniuses, and what they're working on. It's books of profound authority with great detailed knowledge and imparted in a way that people want to read, which is not necessarily how all academic history gets written. But I think it's great that people work on whatever topics they want rather than prescribing it. I think it's that from a starting point, you can't engage with other parts of the world if you don't have any language skills. And that is the single greatest weak point. If you can't speak any other language other than English, and you're only dealing with... I remember spending some time in Bulgaria. I went to do a PhD. I was good on languages, and I had quite an old school PhD supervisor who in my first year, he said, it went through the language I spoke, and I thought, when I get to Swedish and Danish, he's going to be impressed. He wasn't. And then he said, it's a great, your Russian's obviously good. Have you got Bulgarian? So I said, no. He said, well, you won't find that very hard because it's the kind of
Russian.
closest to Old Church Slavonic. And he said, well, you should go to Bulgaria and pick it up and spend a couple of weeks in Romania and pick that up as well. And I remember going back to my college, thinking, okay, well, fair enough, but it's going to be quite a lonely trip because I'm pretty sure none of my friends are going to want to come with me to spend time in the... Although it's great, Anyway.
Did you go to Bulgaria?
Yeah, I did, yeah. And I worked out that the best way to do it was to get a sleeper from Sofia through to the Black Sea coast, which cost me £2.50 in a first-class compartment on my own, crisp linen sheets, just like it, not quite as nice as Clifton, but almost.
And, I'm not sure Clifton would be that
and then
delighted to be compared to Bulgaria.
The railways, trust me. Anyway, and then I'd have a day looking at archaeological sites on the Black Sea in places like Varna and Burgas, and then we'd take the overnight train back to Sofia and spend a day in the mountains, and I did that for 2 or 3 weeks. And first evening, I sat there with my blank page, started writing out Bulgarian vocab and grammar and etc. And some guy came over and was very chatty, wanted to talk, had a beer with me, and he said, "Why the hell are you learning this?" I said, "I'm so interested in the early history of the first Bulgarian Empire." Everyone here knows that the first Bulgarian Empire is more exciting than the second Bulgarian Empire.
Everyone.
Because they had two, right? We only had one in Britain. Although apparently Theresa May, at her first press conference when she became Prime Minister, she said Britain's brightest days lie ahead of us, which as a historian I found quite interesting because we had quite a bright 300
we
years.
did quite well for about 300 years, didn't we?
So, who knows if that meant we were bringing back slavery in colonies.
But so do you think so just talking about that sort of attitude, this sort of
language
Theresa
and
May.
technical skills.
Going back to Theresa May, who we've almost forgotten was once Prime Minister of this country. But the offer of post-Brexit Britain reconquering the world globally looks a little optimistic at the moment, doesn't it?
I wouldn't bet on it. But having said that, the more I guess if one washes out the politics, and everyone here will have 52% and 48% will have a different view on that, and that's not my job to reheat any of those kind of arguments. But one could take a step back and go, this little rock in the North Atlantic for the last few hundred years has significantly outperformed, and at the expense of other people's lives, no question about that when it came to transatlantic. But in today's world, all built on the legacy of that, no harm in reminding. But we significantly outperform at universities. We significantly outperform in specific sectors, including finance. We had a great response to the pandemic. Fantastic Kate Bingham, if she's here. I know she's here at Clifton at the moment. You're welcome. AstraZeneca, that's from my university. That's why many of the people will be here today. There are lots of things we do incredibly well, and we've got to try and work out why that is and what our place is. And part of the call for Global Britain, and I've been involved in the Integrated Review and some of the kind of ideas around that, has been, what is our place in a world that is changing? And quite a good line is that in a world of carnivores, it's quite dangerous to be vegetarian, which is what the world looks like right now. China, other states, you have the capabilities in places like Qatar, UAE. Forget about places like Iran. Iran has 3% of the budget of the US and has basically shaped and dictated the falls of American presidencies for the last 60 years, with almost no spend. Iran is still a problem. Russia, as you know very well, with very limited resources, an economy that's not big, dysfunctional state, is still a top-table player. And these competitors that we're dealing with don't think the same way we do. Right. So Britain has got to think quite hard about how do we fit in, and are we a part of the sort of flotsam in the water? Are we able to influence and shape? And if so, how do we pick our battles? And that's what the British did very well, strategically, work out what it is we needed to do. And so running back to just the languages, so one of the problems, this guy in Bulgaria, it's a long story back to that, he said to me, "What the hell are you doing sitting here learning Bulgarian?" He said, "If I was sitting in England saying, I'm going to write the definitive book about the Battle of Hastings, wouldn't you think it's quite odd for a Bulgarian to do that? So why are you, some English guy, sitting here telling me about my history?" But I think that if you don't teach those kind of skills, and the technical skills for history today are not just languages, it's about understanding statistic and statistical modelling.
And a lot of science.
A lot of science.
Yeah.
A lot of the genomic stuff is the kind of real breakthrough area. And you can't just hop on and read what other people have written and just put it in a footnote. You've got to understand what are the parameters where you might be wrong about movements of people. The linguistics. It's absolutely fascinating. I mean, Madagascan languages are all based on Malay, right? And when someone says that, you go, great, but what bits aren't? How did it get there? How did it change? How did it evolve? And I think that those hard skills require investment. And so the big problem in this country is we've got the private sector that can afford to fund those kinds of investments, although very few young people take them. They'll pick German and French rather than things that look harder. And we could calibrate that quite easily. I mean, my view is if you want to study Arabic, Chinese, Russian at university, government give you a free scholarship for it.
Yeah.
And if you want to study the French Revolution, maybe you don't. Or there are all sorts of ways in which you can, with a little nudge, can do quite a lot to start to think that what is it an 18-year-old that we have, both of us, what should they know about? And they should know something about AI. They should know about machine learning. They should know about robotics, about genomics, linguistics. They should know about how this is going to influence and change the way that we look at the world around us, rather than only knowing how many wives Henry VIII had, or whether, in fact, we've overrated that Henry VIII was not just a bad husband, but also a shit king, which is the kind of the new orthodoxy.
Yeah.
Which is great. So I don't want to input into what anybody else writes and works about, but I think that those skills gaps and skills shortages and skills reward is a problem. That's, by the way, one of the reasons why young women don't go into science, because the bar for academic achievement, places at universities, is much, much lower. So last year, only 1,500 young girls did computer science GCSE because it's perceived as being much riskier and harder to get into the small number of places that offer that as a university degree. So much easier to do history or Latin or geography because loads more people do it. You're more likely to get a good grade, you're more likely to get to a good university, you're more likely to get at least a 2-1, and you're more likely to therefore get a good job. And that's not how a functional, intelligent society should work. You should work out how do you reward and encourage people to do more adventurous things, and particularly with skills gaps in sciences and with gender. That goes across all diversities too, into, of course, ethnicities too. We run this place, it looks like the 19th century rather than the 21st.
Yeah. And do you think, I mean, just you talked about Iran there, just to change from academe and technology to sort of the way the world is run. You gave the example of Iran. It's kind of run round everybody because of sort of a consistent worldview in its region. How do democracies which change government or change policy continually every 5 years or every 6 years compete with these kind of reheated empires with consistent leadership, for 20 or 30 years, like sort of China, Turkey, Iran, Russia? How do we analyze the leadership of those places, those kind of new reheated old empires, really, in the Near East, which are very much in your territory?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's interesting. What do you mean by reheated?
I mean that they're very. First of all, they're conservative states, aren't they? I mean, their attitude to the world is conservative, and obviously internally they want to freeze everything as much, to maintain that Putin or Erdogan wants to keep their leadership as strong as possible.
So I think the conservatism is probably. It's possibly a red herring insofar as what it's really about is regime stability and regime survival.
Yeah.
The views that help enforce that or protect as the priesthood or it almost doesn't matter. If the Iranian leadership tomorrow said everyone has to wear jeans and wear T-shirts, otherwise you're going to get locked up in prison, it's all the same process. That what the beliefs are, in a way, are less important than how small groups of people retain power and don't let anybody else in. How do you shut people out? And I think one of the things we've struggled with in this kind of world that we think we understood quite well, and then suddenly about 3 years ago, we hit the panic button going, oh my God, China's suddenly in our rearview mirror. We don't know where it came from. It's a massive threat. Let's deal with it. We haven't realized that in the last 25 years, democracy's been in retreat globally and quite profoundly. So the democracy index in the last 15 years, democracy's gone backwards every single year for the last decade and a half. And that's partly because non-democratic systems have been quite good at doing low-hanging reform, of cleaning out the judiciary, being quite good at going after corruption, because it suits leaderships, true, quite good at professionalizing how do you encourage digital technology without fragility, and partly because it's quite easy to say that, well, we haven't managed that process in democracies well. We've got real challenges about freedoms of speech, not just on university campuses, but in the kind of discussions we have with each other. When you see the Capitol Hill on the 6th of January, what happened there, it's pretty hard in most regimes, and I don't just mean Iran or China, but in most states around the world, to say, if this is the challenge, if this is the result of what happens if people can connect with each other on digital platforms and they can almost bring down the government. And the single scariest element about that day was not just the scenes on Capitol Hill and so on, it was the fact that Mike Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs, rang his Chinese opposite number and said, "I will ring you and warn you if I'm told to launch." Yeah. And that stuff, so I mean, you're right.
Amazing moment. That was an amazing moment, wasn't it?
And possibly he was stitched up by Bob Woodward. But no, there's been no denial from the US military that those kind of fragilities. So we look like we're highly unstable. Brexit, apart from sucking all the air out of the system, left us singularly unprepared to deal with things at the worst possible moment. And in terms of where we are now with a pandemic to deal with too, having compression on supply chains, on the economics, the energy insufficiencies, and so on. So I think that it's partly that authoritarian and unprogressive regimes have worked out how to retain power and to do it in a way that has uplifted the general population's standards of living. Most people in the world, it's a slightly unfashionable thing to say, most people in the world can live under whatever kind of conditions as long as there is a semblance of meritocracy, as long as you have some form of religious and freedom of expression, but that doesn't have to be a profound one, but above all that your standards of living go up. And if you can keep delivering economic growth and more hospitals get built, new roads, and you think that your kids will have a better life than you've had, then it's quite a logical thing to keep lending probably not your vote, but lending support to the people in charge. And, one of the things in China, for example, is the question about whether there is any internal criticism of China, and if so, what does it look like, where does it take place, how is it mopped up? Because a lot of platforms in China allow lots of criticism and lots of discussion. So it's not just all shut down, it's about key sensitivity points around individuals and the types of criticism that get mopped up and are considered to be a threat. So letting some steam out of the system exists because otherwise it all builds up and becomes too much. But all these states, and particularly the ones we met, you mentioned Erdogan, through the whole way through, including into places like Philippines and Indonesia, are really about providing stability at all costs. And one could make the argument that that's what all governments should be trying to do, trying to be stable, trying to be meritocratic, and not preserve elites. And I think that we're definitely lost in the woods here about how we should not just respond to what other people are doing, but to work out how we should also do that ourselves. The inequality in this country and in the US is profound.
But I remember in the Silk Roads when we were talking about American British policy in Iran and the Arab world, you said but there's such the switches of these policies all are so inconsistent. The change of government, but that goes with democracy, doesn't it? I mean, it means that it's very easy to have a consistent foreign policy if you're Putin or Erdogan or the supreme leader of Iran. It's a lot harder if you're switching every 4 years in an incredibly unstable democratic system. But ironically, the key element of democracy is it provides stability because you can handle bumps much more easily. So autocratic regimes are extremely brittle under pressure, and those pressures happen with pandemics typically, not just with this one, but over history. That autocracies are brittle when it comes to climatic events, and they're brittle with any kind of military and foreign pressure because the sudden knee-jerk reaction is that no one wants to make decisions because they're worried about their own position, and number one always decides. So the decision-making process gets slowed down. People in Wuhan don't tell Beijing what's really happening. People in Beijing try and bluff it out, and that then gets stopped, and by the next thing you know, what could have been contained, at least within Henan province, possibly within Wuhan itself, becomes a global problem. So autocracies and totalitarian regimes, again, as you know from Stalin, are very stable. You can sacrifice the economy, you can sacrifice literally people's lives for political ideology, but they're extremely brittle. So the Soviet Union collapsed more or less overnight. The Eastern Bloc, the Berlin Wall, likewise, the CIA analysis completely missed that. So democracies are very resilient because we allow and we force people to accept when they've got things wrong, and then we don't always learn from their mistakes, but we try and be transparent. We don't always do that as well as we could do, but that is the single best thing about the democracy, is that when shit hits the fan, excuse my language,
there's a kind of process of investigation to work out how that was allowed to happen. And then we repeat the same mistake a few years later.
A couple of things. How brittle is China now? How brittle is the leadership in China now? And secondly, you mentioned the pandemic, obviously, which you predicted something like this about 5 years before, didn't you? But,
No, December before.
December before. So how brittle is Chinese leadership and how dangerous is that? But secondly, obviously, they didn't handle the beginning of the pandemic perfectly, but are they going to benefit massively from it down the road in the future? Are they going to be the great winners from this?
So anybody who tells you that they can give you any authority, any view on Chinese leadership is lying, because
no one knows anything.
There's no eyes, no ears inside the Politburo, so it's all speculation. And as everything with academics or with history, some people's judgment is going to be better than others. But the knowledge is you're shooting in the blind, so it can be highly speculative and almost not worth guessing. In terms of the pandemic, well, they did better. Well, they already have done better. China's economy, China's exports last year went up by 19%. So China's balance payments, its foreign reserves have boomed and soared. And so from that point of view, it's been a boom to the extent that it's overheated China's economy. So there's an energy crisis. Energy consumption has gone up. Manufacturing has gone up to respond to not just PPE, but everyone sitting at home have been buying sofas. So the single largest item of volume of goods traded across from China to the United States last year was sofas and furniture. Because people are saying, well, I've got another 6 months locked in watching Netflix, I'm going to upgrade my sofa. and the price to pay for everyone upgrading their laptops and all the soft stuff that we've all been doing because the government's been paying us to sit at home has meant that Chinese manufacturing has boomed. And that's good for the economy, but the energy to keep the factories open has gone nuts. So energy consumption has risen to the point that China this week, as we go into COP26, are paying energy companies to open coal power fuel plants to try to meet, ironically, our demands. Right? It's some of it is to do with Chinese domestic consumption. It's been a hot summer, and it was hot summer.
What's Chinese condom production telling us over the pandemic? Because I know you're an expert on the condom statistics in China.
As a Catholic, it's one of my top topics.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So condom, it's all to do. Well, actually, Sima, it's a very smart question asking about fertility levels and population sizes, and China has, as everybody will know, quite early talking about China, people talk about the demographic, the pyramid. There are too many people getting older and not enough young people being born. That's partly a product of sort of badly thought through policies of one-child policy that was loosened a couple of years ago to a two-child policy, has now been loosened to a three-child policy to try to encourage more Chinese people to have kids. So the Chinese are now quite anti-condom because they want people to have children and have done that in a kind of joint, we would call it joined-up government, by saying, why are people not having children? And the single thing that you'll hear from, they don't really do focus groups in China, but that it's bloody expensive. And if I've got kids, I've got to send them to after-school clubs. They have little tutors to help them get into the best universities. And I tell my own children, when you apply to Oxbridge, there are about 20,000 applications for 3,000 places. Tricky odds and lots of concern about, are you discriminated against because this or that or whatever. And we say we try and do the best we can. We try and use a lot of contextual data. We try and do it as that merit, and it's always going to be hard. And lots of fantastic kids don't get lucky enough to get in, and they'll come through anyway. In China, for 3,000 places at Tsinghua, there are 9.2 million applicants. So the pressure to get your kids on that conveyor belt. So the Chinese government this summer said, we are banning any form of after-school club. We're banning private tutoring. We're banning any form of non-state learning and curriculum. We're going to try and level up. We're going to try and stop it so that if you've got a competitive advantage, because that we think will make it easier to have children. My own view, for what it's worth, is that if you want to stop people having children, or if you want to encourage people to have children, lay on a bit of free alcohol and some good music on a Friday night. and that would probably be more effective than telling them that it's good, you don't worry about the costs when an 11-year-old wants to buy a pony. But maybe I'm old-fashioned. So the Chinese, what they're trying to do is to say we recognise there's a demographic blip. Some of the projections by 2060 put China's population at 700 million, so almost halving where things are now, and that solves some problems, energy, protein consumption, food, but it we're being listened to.
Yeah.
But it creates other ones.
Yeah.
So it's trying to stay ahead of some of those mega trends. And I do think it's it's slightly banging the same drum again. I think here in Britain and the Western economies, and it's not just because we're democracies, is that we don't plan. Partly because with Brexit, we didn't know from 1 week to the next, were we going to leave? Are we going to leave on this date or that date? What's going to happen with the fish? Can you sell sausages in Northern Ireland? But so it's really important to have those kind of discussions. Like I said, I'm involved in some about what is the UK, what's the world and the UK going to look like in 2050, assuming no wars and nuclear disasters, and what would we need as a set of strategic resources, skills, and how do you plan ahead and try to at least have some sort of plan, which it's very conspicuous that just hasn't been thought through. It's like we've been on a boat without anybody on the bridge for 30 years, no one steering, and now suddenly we're in the middle of a storm and we're trying to mobilise.
But these are the problems with liberal democracy, aren't they, in a sense? Because you have this flexibility when the government changes and so on. But the problem is that planning is very short term. And that's a sort of inbuilt problem with it, don't you think?
If you, I suppose, take a historian's view, we all think back and go, well, it wasn't Thatcherism and whatever. But the 20th century, from a British perspective, was one catastrophic decision after another. Empire gone, that was, part of the cost of the war and legacy. But Suez, Iran, what was it that the Foreign Office got right in the 20th century? What was it that the economists got right? Apart from freeing up markets, privatising utilities, we now realise that holy shit, that means that poor people in Britain have energy poverty because they can't pay for their gas bills.
Yeah.
Over the course of a sudden 2-week surge in prices where our friend Mr. Putin decides to divert gas to not fill up his own tanks and send it towards China and to maybe think that there's a bit of political pressure to put on us, that privatisation that made a lot of people rich suddenly turns out that there's a downside to it. And so we've got lots and lots of things wrong, and I think that the call sheet of how do we prepare for and add foreign policy, add Afghanistan, add Iraq, through to education, through to there wasn't a kind of golden age where the British Empire worked seamlessly and worked on a pin and made good decisions. It's complicated to get things right, and it's much easier to get things wrong. And usually people get lots of things wrong, but it's what you learn from it, and ideally not to repeat those same mistakes.
Yeah. We're going to ask questions in a second. I just want to ask you two kind of basic questions. Which could have half-hour answers, but basically, what does China want? I mean, is the Belt and Road policy a better way of empire building or spreading influence than the traditional empires that we all read? We showed in the 19th century. Is it a better way? What do they want?
Well, it's a better way because they're not enslaving people.
Yeah.
They're not putting people in shackles and shipping them across
and
the Atlantic.
They don't have, and nor do they have soldiers there. They don't need boots on the ground yet.
It's not a colonization, but it presents threats. But exactly which threats, where, to whom, and why, all of those you need to look at individual countries, individual projects, and I think requires a proper detailed answer. So I mean, it's like most things in life. There's the smart-ass couple of sentences. There's a kind of 2-page executive summary, and then there's proper work that goes on around it. And part of the problem is that we're rattled by China, and it's for lots of very good reasons. But it means that what we want is China good or is it bad? And that maybe is not the most helpful way to be looking at it. Belt and Road, just for what it's worth, all it does is it provides a narrative. It's quite a clever, bit like the title of my book, which I owe my wife, by the way, endless cups of coffee and champagne for helping come up with. We were sitting around thinking, how do I write? Is the Silk Roads on its own a name that will work? And actually saying it's a new history of the world was really important to show that it's about these connections. It's not just about great buildings in Samarkand and people thinking, God, I'd love to go there one day. And can you recommend somewhere to stay? Which is what people used to ask.
It is partly that too.
It's partly that, but it's those connections. I think that sort of the story that China's trying to tell is to say, in the past, the West enslaved, that's part of the subtext. We, on the other hand, sent caravans of camels, and we're only here to trade. We don't care what faiths you have, we don't care what you look like, we won't treat you the same way as your colonizers or former colonizers. And that's quite a powerful message when they turn up. And so a friend of mine who's a finance minister in one of the states in West Africa, I was talking to him or exchanging emails with him over lockdown, and he said, look, I'm fed up with people from the State Department and the Foreign Office turning up or ringing me and saying, stop taking funding from China. Because my first question is, will you fund our hospitals and schools and, you know, new port facilities? And they say, well, we haven't got, so sorry, we don't have the cash. And then when furlough happened and Rishi Sunak, basically over the course of an afternoon, said, we're going to put people on furlough for the next year and take on £300 billion worth, maybe £400 billion worth of debt. And he said, so you do have the money, magically, to pay people to sit at home. So either stop telling us what to do in a kind of colonial way, don't trust the Chinese, they'll indebt you, will you put your money where your mouth is, or stop telling us how to run our own country, and also presupposes that we're stupid and that we in Africa are not able to make decisions because we're taken in by the Chinese checkbook. And so I think that we have failed to engage with other parts of the world, and these massive populations, these massive resources that we should be allocating, and we oversimplify. So in a lot of those cases, you know, there's been chat for the last 5 years about how the United States is going to build a Belt and Road and a Blue Dot network. Now it's called the Build Back Better network. And there's lots of manuals and documents that get produced, but it's always about cash. Are you willing to put money into upgrading other parts of the world? And can you do that in a way that is selective and is beneficial? You know, why would you put more money into, for example, West Africa? But you know, the Obama administration gutted US aid to the continent of Africa as a whole, that Bush had been, ironically, been quite good on. Trump collapsed that even more. And so we have these kind of isolation states that provides vacuums that when the Chinese arrive in Kazakhstan or in Malaysia and say, we'll build stuff, we'll help fund it, you work out whether you want it and whether you'll pay for some or all of it. They're the only show in town. And I think we should probably think through, is that a bad thing? And if so, why? And what are we going to do about it above all?
I think that's a good place to stop. We've got 15 minutes. So who would like to ask questions?
Can I also just say, if there's anybody under the age of 25, will you put your hand up and make sure that you get asked if you or anybody, and young is elastic these days, maybe under the age of 30. Maybe there's no one under the age
Okay, there's somebody.
Yes, somebody young. Yes,
looking very young.
Yeah. Oh, okay, no
You don't have a question?
There's someone here, there's a round of applause. Somebody young.
Somebody young. Who would like to ask something? Yeah. In the middle there, I think it's a gentleman.
There's a microphone at the back, yeah.
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 Okay, far away.
Do you want to stand up so we see? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. You touched on Iran, and you said that one of the factors which means that autocratic regimes can remain stable is an increase in living conditions for the average person. Iran doesn't fall into that category. Most of the standard of living in Iran is falling. How, in those circumstances, does the regime remain stable?
Well, oppressive police technologies help, but it's all about regime stability. I mean, in fact, if you know Iran, it depends which city you're talking about and which region. But you know, Iran has one of the most digitally connected young populations on earth. But suppression is obviously a key part of autocratic. I mean, it's so obvious that I maybe should have made that slightly more clear. But the key point, I think, in Iran is that the whole process is about regime stability. Rouhani and those living conditions, as it happens, have been helped in the kind of narrative in Iran about being under sanctions. You know, if you can't bring in medical supplies and food, which has been one of the functions of the JCPOA falling apart and under Trump, has meant that the Iranians can explain the reason they're suffering is because the Great Satan is on their case. And there's something in that. You know, that happened in Iraq too in the 1990s, where sanctions were imposed. And so it's not a simple answer. It's very easy to simplify and say this is how it always works. But I think in states like Iran, keeping a lid on pressure needs to be promising that there are going to be improvements. And that's a balance that is very, very shaky, of course.
Who's next? This gentleman here?
It's a question about your confrontation by China with liberal democracies. What's your view on China's confrontation with Australia, and what lessons can be learned, and what the prognosis is between those two bilateral relationships?
Well, so Australia has a very big Chinese diaspora and has been has had quite a good 20 years on China becoming much, much richer. China has turned the taps off on Australian trade, putting on blockade, just to everybody in the room, I'm sure you all know anyway, but a blockade on things like beef imports and on coal in particular, that has had a very significant impact on the Australian economy. The COVID and the withdrawal of Chinese students because of the diplomatic pressure from Australian universities led to 18,000 university staff losing their jobs in the last 18 months. So part of the problem is Australia was undiversified and overcommitted and plugged into gambling that China's economy would always be coupled to it and there would only be upsides. Malcolm Turnbull is a friend of mine who was the Prime Minister before Scott Morrison, I think was quite sanguine about trying to manage those risks. But this is what happens if you, I think, are not have all your eggs in one basket, things go wrong. In terms of what happens next, I think that the AUKUS deal, which I've been talking about a bit this week on the submarine deal, it's going to take years to build these subs, but is a big statement of intent that the Australians feel that that's going to open up new channels of communication and perhaps unblock some of this. But in a kind of rising Cold War type situation, I think it's extremely unpredictable what might happen next. But it's left, as you'll sound like you probably know, the Australian economy in a very difficult and compromised position. And you have a problem of geography to deal with. It's much easier to be looking up north-south axis towards China than looking westwards. But there needs to be a reorientation. And I guess the moral of the lesson is spread those eggs a bit more widely.
Yeah, next. This gentleman at the front.
Yes, I'd like to follow on from that.
Wait for the mic. Thanks. Thank you.
The issues as to what China's all about in Africa and other parts of the world. But I think you've just answered the question, that China's after political control. Because when it doesn't get its way with a country like Australia, then it turns the screws on Australia, and it will do the same in the African countries, and that's what China's trying to do. It's colonialism in a different way, but it is political control of these countries by economic means.
Is that a question?
That sounds like
It's a question,
Yeah.
it's a question and a statement. Yes.
Yes, I mean.
I was asked for your opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, what I point out to my colleagues in the State Department and the US Treasury is that that's exactly how the United States does business. The United States put trade blockades on key sectors and tariffs on Chinese imports and exports, valuing in hundreds of billions of dollars under the Trump administration, and for very good reasons to balance up some of those inequalities in the trading relationship, and not surprisingly. But that's a tool of politics and of diplomacy to try to force other people to do what you want. But the Chinese have learned a lot of lessons from how other people in other parts of the world do things as well. And I think one of the things about China is that similarities of the trajectory of how China uses its muscles, because it's seen that that's what the US does in Iraq and Syria and so on. As far as Africa goes, I do think it's not the same as colonialism. I think it's different to dominating people's countries and running it and taking their resources away from them. What the Chinese would tell you, and what the states and not all of Africa has the same level of exposure to China, will say it's about finding a price, environmental as well as a commercial one, about what that extraction looked like and how those proceeds get distributed. But I think that we fall into a trap of saying the Chinese and the African people are all corrupt and all unwilling to look after their own people, unless that's based in fact. And I can give you lots of examples where there are proper problems, but I can give you lots of examples where that's not the case. But I think we need to be a bit more nuanced and highly project specific. The key thing is China's trying to get hold of assets and resources that it needs for its own people, particularly protein, but also energy. But there are choke points and strategic interests for sure that are important. That more of a worry. Yeah.
Okay, this lady here.
Yeah.
We've got one. You're next. Yeah, fire away.
Hi, what would you advise a teenager to do to expand learning beyond English history, or maybe when we're a bit older go and live somewhere to best prepare ourselves for international problems?
Okay, that's such a great question. And you get bonus points for asking it being, I think, under the age of 30. But I've also learned, and I'm not, it sounds like I'm trying to be cute. Do you know what? I also, because I've got younger kids, you will be able to answer that question better than me. What do you think? What do you think that someone your age, given what you've heard today and what you know, what do you think you should be taught how to do that you haven't been taught how to do?
Well, maybe in schools we mostly just learn about, as you said, like Henry VIII. We don't really kind of learn about the history of China or anything. What we do have is lots of kind of societies, which is great. But I think it would be good to incorporate into like the actual curriculum, sort of world history, rather than just Western Europe or England. And also, of course, like recommending books, documentaries, and advice for what we do, like after university or something.
It's a great answer. I mean, all I'd say, and again, you will be digitally savvy, your ability to, I mean, one of the things I used to tell my kids is that, or our kids, my wife said too, when we were driving, is that for every one of their 10 songs by Ed Sheeran or Drake or God knows who, they'd have to listen to one of ours. And in fact, not even one of Jessica would only put David Bowie, but one of mine. And so I would force them to listen to Turkish rap or Hungarian hip hop or stuff, or Korean music. And I would say, I'm not asking you to like it. I'm not asking you to put it on your playlist. But I would like you to tell me whether you like it or don't like it, and to tell me why. And we brought them up saying, do you think that someone your age in Shanghai or in Lima or in Johannesburg, what are they listening to? What are they watching on TV? And the stuff that you can access for free, music, movies, all the soft stuff. Learning is, we sort of make it sound like learning should be books and boring dead people, rather than how do you engage? What kind of, one of the great things about this country has been, trust me, everyone who's over the age of 30 will know that the way that food in this country has changed over the last 20, 30 years. I mean, it was absolutely diabolical. And now we have the riches we had for dinner last night, an absolute joy. But we're quite good at having cookbooks from different parts of the world. We're quite good on the TV programs of celebrating and cherry picking. So experiencing different things so that we don't just turn up with meat and two veg. We don't just know about David Beckham. We don't just know about Henry VIII. And history is a really important part of that, but it's the same all over the world. What do people think, believe, do? What apps do people use in India? How do people in Kenya, for example, the super app is one of the really big innovations at the moment in technologies that haven't reached us here, but are being developed in places where infrastructure is of a lower standard. And so super apps of how you can do everything inside one app. So what is it that people like you, your age, do, think, behave, live, watch, listen to? And almost all of that is free. I mean, obviously great if you can go and learn Khmer or learn Turkish or whatever, but you can get so far down the line of being able to think and learn. And in fact, when you do travel or you meet people here, because we're so cosmopolitan, who come from different countries, the fact that you know anything about them, it's a kind of opener of a proper dialogue, rather than people knowing that we have Wimbledon eat cucumber in their sandwiches, which everybody knows about. But if we were to teleport to the streets of Chongqing, which has 30 million people in it, and we showed a bunch of slides, every single person there, well, give or take, would recognize David Beckham, Tom Cruise, George Clooney. But if you were to say who is the best-selling film star in China, India, Pakistan, the Latin, South America, Africa, what novelists are there, what music people listen to, most people in this room would not be able to give a single answer. And that can be corrected if you're curious and if your parents keep paying for your Spotify and Netflix account.
Brilliant. This lady here.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Hi there. Two quick things. One, with respect to your point about Africa and the attitudes towards Western intervention, I would just make the point that a lot of the time it's not that Africans want more money to gouge British, or Britain or the United States. They just think it's pure hypocrisy. The Chinese are the largest foreign lender to the U.S. government. I mean, don't tell us to not take money from China when you're actually happy to take it. So that's point one. Point two, I'd love for you to just give us a little bit of your perspective on how big the gap is between what we believe is going on in government and public policy circle, State Department, in terms of their knowledge, strategic thinking, etc., versus what's actually happening. Because we've had a series of calamities, the pandemic, Arab Spring, financial crisis, where not only did it not seem to have been anticipated, but the response was incredibly weak. Is the gap huge, and is there something we can do about it? Thank you.
We've got 2 minutes, by the way.
So I'll do. Is there any other questions? I'll do it quick so we get one more.
Yeah, do a medley.
So let me have one more question. I can do two.
Somebody at the back.
Yeah.
Somebody there. Yeah.
Yes, Simon Peter, thank you. China's risen and faltered before, and whilst its economic growth is extraordinary, are there some structural impediments that actually might change the narrative?
Okay. And then one last one at the back. There was a gentleman at the back.
Gentleman at the very back there. Yeah. Last question, please.
Earlier you mentioned the point about how people often forget the fact that the British played a part in the slave trade. I wanted to know if you think there are any implications on society today in terms of the treatment of black people as a result of that traumatic experience and process.
Okay, great. Are you here this afternoon?
Yeah.
So I'm on a panel with two brilliant speakers at 5 o'clock, where that's going to be exactly what we talk about. So you can come and catch me afterwards, because that will take a long. I mean, it'll be and people better than me to talk about. But it's a very good question. So I'll be lurking. Come and find me, and I'll answer that one because it needs a long answer. The skill gap. It's a very good question. Part of the problem, and I'm very sympathetic to it, is our politicians are responding constantly at enormous speed and under huge pressure. So the ability to find headspace to become better informed about parts of the world or big themes, it's really hard because of the cycle of news, constituency demands. There are all sorts of ways in which you can give reading space. The summer holidays, I guess, is for part of that, but it's very hard to read into these big subjects quickly. So there is a kind of gap about people who make policy. Right now, Biden's infrastructure plan in the US is going to be derailed by West Virginia coal miners, senators of a West Virginia trying to protect coal mining jobs for 12,000 people, which will derail a $3.5 trillion plan because the senator wants to show that he's going to stand up for American coal miners. So the political system sometimes hits the skids. The skills gap is in the military in these countries. They're some of the best strategic thinkers in the world. They're above the level of major corporations, of Goldman Sachs. Very, 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 very smart. But in this country, with smaller and smaller resources and trying to work out to a changing landscape that is really hard to try and figure through. So there's lots of expertise. And Simon, very nice to see you here. Are there structural problems? Yes. I mean, running a big business, any sort of supply chain knock can suddenly put everything in the wrong place very quickly. And we have not understood supply chain issues carefully enough. China is one giant supply chain problem, which is its great strength when things work. And when it goes wrong, things can go into collapse. So right now, the biggest problem, other than real estate bubbles and pops with Evergrande and so on, is around energy shortage. And a lot of the things that go through China don't get picked up and reported in the press here because there are no ears on the ground. China's pushed a lot of journalists out, very good at mopping up bad news stories. And so shortages of manufacturing is a real problem. So Tesla and Toyota both shut their factories in mainland China because they can't keep the factories open. And those things go through quite quickly. Another structural problem, the last thing I'll say, is that about 150 million pigs have been killed this year because of African swine flu in China. Almost the whole of the Chinese pig market is controlled by smallholders and small owners of relatively small swine herds. And the destruction of those animals means zero livelihood. And so when you suddenly take away a large section of society or suddenly make them much poorer, like with Iran, you suddenly have a collapsed process of economic capacity and standard of living that can magnify into structural problems.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Peter's going to be signing books in the bookshop. Thank you very much for coming today. And Peter, thanks. Brilliant. Thank you very much.